6 enemy jets on radar. I was alone, and I had to hold the line. That morning started like any other patrol. Clear skies over the disputed territory. Routine radio checks with base command. Nobody expected action that day. I'd been flying the F-16 for nearly 15 years, but nothing prepares you for that moment when your radar suddenly lights up with multiple bogies entering your airspace. My heart jumped when control confirmed, hostile aircraft inbound. Intercept immediately. The calm voice over the radio couldn't mask the gravity of what was happening. 6 against 1 weren't odds anyone would take willingly, but I was the only thing between them and our forward operating base where over 200 personnel were completely vulnerable. I remember thinking about the photo of my daughter I always kept taped to my instrument panel as I banked hard right and climbed to 30,000 feet. She was only 8, with her mother's eyes and my stubborn determination. That's when training kicks in, when your mind wants to panic but your hands keep steady on the controls. The enemy formation was approaching fast from the northeast. MiG-29s according to intelligence, each carrying enough ordnance to flatten our base. I could almost hear my first flight instructor's voice. Position is everything in aerial combat. So I climbed higher, using the sun on my back. They hadn't spotted me yet, which gave me the one advantage I desperately needed: surprise. That split-second advantage might be the only thing keeping me alive in the next few minutes. The radio crackled with urgent messages from base. Reinforcements were scrambling, but wouldn't arrive for at least 20 minutes. 20 minutes might as well be a lifetime in air combat. I switched to combat mode, arming my AM-120 AMRAAM missiles and checking my cannon status. Everything operational. My palms were sweating inside my flight gloves as I watched the formation approaching on my radar screen. They were flying in a standard search pattern, spreading out to maximize coverage. Classic tactics, but meant they weren't flying tight, which could work to my advantage if I could separate them. The mission parameters were clear in my mind: delay, disrupt, and, if possible, deter. I didn't need to down all 6, just break up their attack run long enough for our reinforcements to arrive. My hands tightened on the controls as I made my decision. I'd come in from above, take out the lead aircraft with my first missile, then dive through their formation to force them to scatter. It was risky, downright crazy if I'm being honest, but it was the only plan that gave our base a fighting chance. The enemy jets were now just 60 seconds from entering weapons range of our base. Time seemed to slow as I pushed the throttle forward, feeling the raw power of the engine thrust me back into my seat. The G-forces pressed against my chest as I positioned for the attack run. What happened next would either become a textbook example of tactical air defense or my last mission. And as I lined up my first target, I couldn't help but wonder how those MiG pilots would react when they realized they weren't facing a squadron, but a single determined defender. I didn't hesitate. Couldn't afford to. The lead MiG was perfectly centered in my HUD when I squeezed the trigger, sending my first AMRAAM streaking toward him. Fox 3, I called out instinctively, though only base control was listening. The missile cut through the clear blue sky, leaving a thin white trail as it accelerated toward the unsuspecting enemy formation. 12 seconds can feel like an eternity when you're watching a missile track toward its target. I was already moving, banking hard right, and diving to change my position. The enemy still hadn't spotted me against the sun when the missile found its mark. The lead MiG disappeared in a bright flash, debris scattering across the sky. That's when all hell broke loose. The remaining 5 fighters broke formation instantly, radar warning systems finally alerting them to my presence. Their coordinated attack on our base was now a frantic scramble to locate me. Combat is chaos, but there's a strange clarity that comes with it too. Everything non-essential fades away. No thoughts of tomorrow, no worries about yesterday, just the immediate demands of survival. 2 MiGs broke left while 3 turned right, trying to catch me in a pincer movement. Standard response to an ambush. I pushed my F-16 into a steep dive, feeling the negative G's trying to pull me out of my seat as warning alarms blared in my cockpit. Missile lock. The distinct tone every fighter pilot dreads filled my helmet as one of the MiGs had gotten a lock faster than I anticipated. I released chaff and flares while rolling into an evasive corkscrew maneuver. The missile streaked past my right wing, close enough that I felt the vibration of its passage through my airframe. Too close. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled out of the dive, scanning frantically for the next threat. The 5 remaining MiGs had regrouped quickly. Too quickly. They were coordinating their attack with precision that suggested these weren't ordinary pilots. I recognized the tactics from briefings about their elite squadron commanders. If I was right, I was facing some of their best. I needed to separate them again, make them react rather than act. Banking hard toward the nearest pair, I triggered a short burst from my 20mm cannon, not expecting a hit at this range, but forcing them to break apart defensively. It worked. As they split, I locked onto the left aircraft and launched my second missile. Fox 3. The MiG pilot was good, immediately deploying countermeasures and diving sharply. But good isn't always enough. The missile tracked through his chaff cloud and found its mark. A second explosion lit up the sky. For left. My missile count was running low, and they were adapting to my tactics now. The radio crackled with an update from base. Reinforcements still 15 minutes out. Status report. I didn't have time for a detailed briefing. Engaged with multiple bandits. 2 down for active. Tell reinforcements to hurry. My voice sounded calmer than I felt as I yanked the stick hard to avoid incoming fire from one of the MiGs that had managed to get on my 6. The airframe groaned under the stress of the high G turn as cannon fire streaked past my canopy. These weren't just elite pilots. They were angry now. I disrupted their mission and taken out 2 of their own. They weren't just trying to complete their objective anymore. They wanted me out of the sky, permanently. I could feel their determination as they coordinated their next attack, tightening their formation to limit my options. They were setting a trap, and I was running out of sky to maneuver in. With ammunition limited and energy advantage diminishing, I needed to change the dynamics of this engagement fast. What these pilots didn't know was that I had trained specifically for these odds during classified exercises that pushed us beyond conventional tactics. What happens when you're outnumbered 4-1 with nowhere to run? You change the rules. I cut power suddenly, deploying air brakes in a maneuver that fighter pilots call the snake, a radical deceleration that no pursuer expects. The MiG that had been closing on my tail shot past me, his pilot's surprised face visible through his canopy as our aircraft passed within meters of each other. Before he could react, I had him locked in my sights. The cannon roared, 20mm rounds tearing into his engine housing. No explosion this time, but black smoke poured from his damaged aircraft as he peeled away from the fight. He was out of the equation, limping back toward his own territory. 3 effective combatants remained, but they'd lost their numerical advantage in coordinating attacks from all sides. Now, they had to recalculate, and that hesitation gave me precious seconds to reposition. I climbed rapidly, burning fuel at an alarming rate, but gaining the high ground again. The remaining MiGs followed, exactly as I'd hoped. They were determined to finish this, their formation tightening as they pursued me upward. My altimeter spun as we climbed past 40,000 feet, the air thinning, engines straining. Radio chatter from their formation drifted through my headset, fragmented communications in their language that our systems partially translated. They were confused about my strategy, wondering why I was climbing when I could have used the cloud layer below for cover. What they didn't realize was that I was leading them into position for what we call the Falcon Dive, a high-altitude ambush technique developed by my squadron but never before used in actual combat. The technique was classified, practiced only in remote training airspace where foreign intelligence couldn't observe. At 45,000 feet, I suddenly cut power again and used the aircraft's momentum to continue climbing while simultaneously rolling into an inverted position. The MiGs, still in climbing pursuit, weren't prepared for this unorthodox maneuver. From my inverted position, I had a perfect upside-down view of all 3 aircraft still climbing toward me, engines at full thrust completely exposed. Time seemed to crystallize in that moment. I could see the lead pilot look up, suddenly aware of the trap, but it was too late. From this position, my third missile had a clean trajectory downward. Fox 3. The missile dropped briefly before its motor ignited, then accelerated toward the middle MiG. The pilot tried to evade, braking right, but the missile's downward momentum combined with its propulsion gave it an unprecedented attack angle that was nearly impossible to escape. The explosion took out not just my target, but damaged the wingman flying too close in formation. Both aircraft began spiraling downward, one with its entire right wing sheared off, the other trailing fire and smoke. The pilots ejected, parachutes blossoming against the deep blue sky as their aircraft continued plummeting toward the earth below. One enemy remained, but he'd witnessed the destruction of his entire squadron in less than 5 minutes. He broke away hard, afterburners glowing as he accelerated back toward the border. I could have pursued, had him in my sights, finger hovering over the trigger. But something stopped me. Maybe it was respect for a fellow pilot who knew when the mission was lost. Maybe it was knowing that he'd carry the story back to his comrades, the story of what happens when they cross into our airspace. I watched his retreating form until it disappeared from visual range, then checked my fuel gauge. It was dangerously low after the high-energy engagement. I'd have just enough to make it back to base, where I knew debriefing officers would be waiting with wide eyes and endless questions about how a single F-16 had just defeated 6 elite enemy fighters. Landing with emergency fuel levels is never routine, even after the adrenaline rush of combat. My hands were steady, but my flight suit was soaked with sweat as I guided the F-16 down onto the runway. Maintenance crews and security personnel were already assembled on the tarmac. Word of the engagement had spread throughout the base. As I taxied to a stop and shut down the engines, the sudden silence was almost disorienting. For hours earlier, I'd taken off for a routine patrol. Now I was returning with 4 confirmed kills and 1 damaged enemy aircraft. Statistics that would have been impressive for an entire squadron, let alone a single pilot. The canopy raised with a hydraulic hiss, and the first face I saw was Colonel Barrett's, his usual stoic expression replaced with something I'd never seen before, genuine amazement. "Welcome back, Captain," he said as I climbed down, my legs surprisingly shaky now that the danger had passed. That was the most extraordinary display of aerial combat I've witnessed in 30 years of service. The debriefing lasted hours, every decision scrutinized, every maneuver analyzed. Intelligence officers recorded every detail, while tactical commanders debated the implications of the engagement. What none of us realized then was how far the ripples of this incident would spread. By evening, satellite imagery confirmed the wreckage of the downed aircraft, validating my account. By the next morning, intercepted communications revealed the enemy Air Force had established a new protocol for crossing the border. Minimum squadron strength doubled, with explicit orders to retreat if engaged by the ghost pilot, as they'd begun calling me. The name seemed melodramatic, but it stuck. 3 days later, I stood at attention before the base assembled as the general pinned the distinguished flying cross on my uniform. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment for news outlets around the country. My daughter watched from the front row, her eyes wide with a mixture of pride and concern that only a child who understands the dangers of a parent's profession can express. For extraordinary heroism and uncommon valor in aerial combat, the citation read, but the words seemed hollow compared to what really mattered. I'd prevented an attack on hundreds of unsuspecting personnel, people with families and futures. The medal was nice, but the handshakes from base mechanics, radar technicians, and the medical staff afterward meant more. They understood what had nearly happened that day, how close the enemy had come to our doorstep. What the public statements never mentioned was the psychological toll. The nightmare started 3 days after the engagement. Vivid replays of those critical moments when split-second decisions determined who lived and died. Military psychologists call it post-combat stress response, a normal reaction to abnormal circumstances. They assured me it would fade with time, and mostly they were right. But even years later, the sound of a jet at high altitude can send me back to that moment, hanging inverted at 45,000 feet, watching enemy aircraft climb into my trap. The technical investigation ultimately revealed why the enemy squadron had been so determined to press their attack despite meeting resistance. Intelligence recovered from the wreckage showed they hadn't been targeting our base at all. They'd been hunting for our new early warning radar system that had just been installed in the mountains beyond. The system was so classified that even I hadn't known about it. The enemy had committed their elite pilots to the mission, considering it worth the risk. What they hadn't counted on was encountering a defender who refused to be intimidated by superior numbers. Every combat engagement teaches us something if we're willing to learn. The technical analysis of my encounter with the MiGs revealed insights that changed our training protocols across the entire Air Force. The gun camera footage, analyzed frame by frame, showed precisely how the enemy pilots had coordinated their attacks using a communications system more advanced than our intelligence had previously identified. They were using encrypted burst transmissions lasting milliseconds, virtually undetectable unless you knew exactly what to look for. This discovery led to an immediate upgrade of our electronic warfare systems. Sometimes it takes direct combat to expose vulnerabilities and capabilities that remain hidden during peacetime surveillance. The enemy's aircraft had performed beyond their published specifications too, exhibiting climb rates and maneuverability that suggested recent undocumented upgrades to their fleet. Perhaps the most valuable insight came from studying how the enemy formation adapted to unexpected resistance. Their initial response to losing their lead aircraft showed evidence of pre-planned contingencies, but when forced to improvise against my unconventional tactics, cracks appeared in their coordination. This validated something our best tacticians had long suspected, that their pilots were extensively drilled in set-piece maneuvers, but less prepared for dynamic, unpredictable combat scenarios. This insight proved invaluable in developing new training programs for our own pilots. Within 6 months, every fighter squadron was practicing against what became known as ghost scenarios, simulated encounters where pilots faced overwhelming odds and were forced to use creativity rather than just firepower. The engagement had exposed both strengths and vulnerabilities on both sides, and the lessons would shape doctrine for years to come. What fascinated the engineers most was how the aircraft itself had performed beyond its design parameters. The F-16 systems had been pushed to their absolute limits during my high-G maneuvers and the inverted missile launch. Data from the flight recorder showed stress levels on the airframe that approached but never quite exceeded maximum tolerances, a testament to the brilliance of the original design team. The maintenance chief, Master Sergeant Wilkins, spent weeks performing extra inspections on every component that might have been compromised. "You flew her hard, Captain," he told me one evening as we stood in the hangar, looking at the aircraft under the harsh fluorescent lights. "But she kept up with you every step of the way." There was respect in his voice, not for me, but for the machine we both served in different capacities. He understood, as all good ground crew do, that the relationship between pilot and aircraft is a partnership. The most controversial aspect of the analysis concerned my decision not to pursue the final MiG as it retreated. Military doctrine is clear. An enemy combatant remains a threat until neutralized. Yet the review board ultimately endorsed my judgment call. Conservation of resources in a fuel-critical situation, the official report stated, but the senior officers in the room understood the unwritten reality of combat, that sometimes mercy serves strategy better than merciless efficiency. The enemy pilot who escaped became an unexpected intelligence asset, his first-hand account of the engagement spreading through their ranks, growing with each retelling into something approaching mythology. Intercepted communications in the months that followed revealed a reluctance among their pilots to engage in similar operations along our border. Fear is a powerful deterrent, but respect combined with fear is even more effective. The technical data from that engagement continues to inform simulator programs at the Air Combat Command Training Center, where new pilots still study the maneuvers and countermeasures that worked that day against superior numbers. 10 years have passed since that fateful engagement, and its impact continues to resonate through military aviation circles worldwide. What began as a classified incident eventually became a case study taught at Air Force academies internationally. Of course, certain details remain restricted. The exact specifications of the Falcon dive maneuver, the precise electronic countermeasures employed, but the broader tactical lessons have been incorporated into standard combat doctrine. Perhaps the most significant legacy was the shift in asymmetric engagement philosophy. Before my encounter, conventional wisdom held that a lone fighter against multiple opponents should focus on evasion until reinforcements arrived. My success challenged that assumption, proving that under the right circumstances, aggressive counterattack could disrupt enemy cohesion more effectively than defensive maneuvering. This paradigm shift influenced the development of the next generation of fighter aircraft, which emphasized pilot initiative and systems flexibility over rigid operational parameters. The diplomatic repercussions were equally significant, though less publicly acknowledged. 3 months after the incident, peace talks that had stalled for years suddenly resumed with new momentum. Intelligence sources confirmed what many suspected. The loss of their elite pilots and advanced aircraft had forced a strategic reassessment at the highest levels of their military command. Sometimes demonstration of capability accomplishes more than threats or sanctions. The border violations that had been increasing in frequency before my engagement dropped to near zero in the years that followed. Military historians would later identify this as a turning point in the regional power dynamic, though few outside classified briefing rooms understood the connection between one aerial engagement and the broader geopolitical shift. The enemy learned a costly lesson about underestimating their opponent's resolve and capability. My personal journey continued as well. After declining several desk promotions that would have grounded me, I eventually accepted a position at the Tactical Development Squadron, where I helped design training scenarios based on my experience. Working alongside engineers and younger pilots was gratifying in ways combat never could be. Watching ideas transform into capabilities that would protect future generations of aviators. The Ghost Protocol training module became standard for all fighter pilots, emphasizing adaptability, resource management, and psychological warfare aspects of air combat that had previously been underemphasized. Pilots who master these scenarios receive a small ghost patch for their flight suits, an unofficial acknowledgement that carries more prestige within the fighter community than many formal decorations. Some traditions matter more than regulations, particularly among those who understand the realities behind the symbols. What stays with me most, however, isn't the recognition or the tactical innovations that followed. It's the letters I still occasionally receive from family members of personnel who were at the base that day. Most begin the same way. You don't know me, but you saved my husband/wife/son/daughter. These correspondences remind me that aerial combat isn't ultimately about aircraft specifications or maneuver theory. It's about protecting people who cannot protect themselves. One letter in particular sits framed on my desk at home, from a young woman whose father was manning the radar station that detected the incoming MiGs. She was 12 when she wrote it, her handwriting carefully formed in blue ink. "My dad came home because of you. He saw my graduation last week. Thank you for being brave when it was scary." That letter reminds me why we fly these missions, why we train relentlessly for scenarios we hope never materialize. The true measure of success in our profession isn't medals or promotions or even tactical innovations. It's in the ordinary moments that happen because someone stood between danger and home. As we've explored this extraordinary air combat encounter, I hope you've gained insight into what really happens when skill, courage, and tactical innovation come together in the crucible of aerial warfare. These stories aren't just about machines and weapons. They're about human determination against overwhelming odds. The pilot who faced 6 enemy fighters that day demonstrated something beyond technical proficiency. He showed us the power of psychological resilience and creative thinking under extreme pressure. What would you do if faced with seemingly impossible odds in your own life? How might you apply the principles of tactical deception, using unexpected approaches to transform disadvantages into advantages? The greatest battles aren't always won by those with superior numbers or resources, but by those who refuse to accept defeat as inevitable. Think about that the next time you face a challenging situation that seems beyond your capabilities. The legacy of extraordinary combat engagements like this one continues to shape military aviation doctrine worldwide. But perhaps the most important question is, what lessons can you apply from this story to overcome obstacles in your own journey? Are you approaching challenges with predictable tactics, or are you willing to innovate and surprise those who underestimate you? If you found this exploration of aerial combat tactics and military courage inspiring, don't keep it to yourself. Share this knowledge with others who appreciate the remarkable stories of those who defend our skies. Subscribe to our channel now and activate notifications so you never miss our next in-depth analysis of classified military operations and the extraordinary individuals behind them. Remember, in combat and in life, it's not the size of the force that determines the outcome, but the strength of will and tactical brilliance of those who refuse to surrender when facing impossible odds.